In this video, we're going to cover an introduction to viruses. So first of all, let's do a review of something that you probably covered in a previous biology class, and that is the characteristics of life, or the characteristics that all living things have. For starters, all living things have order, and with order, we're talking about this kind of hierarchy of life. All matter is made up of atoms. Atoms can bond together to form molecules. Molecules can make organelles. Organelles can make cells. Cells can make tissues. Tissues can make organs. Organs can make organ systems, which can make these complex organisms. And then organisms can form populations and communities. And then if we add in the abiotic or the non-living factors, we can form ecosystems, which ultimately forms the biosphere, which is Earth. Now, some organisms do stop at this kind of cellular level, and we're going to talk more about prokaryotes in a different video. But there are some organisms that are unicellular, meaning they are made up of one cell. This actually brings us to our third bullet point, that all living things are made of cells. And then going back to responding to stimuli, so all living things respond to stimuli. Now, this could be something like a flower growing towards the sun, or an animal moving from one place to another. Living organisms can also grow and reproduce, and they can develop. So growing just means that they're getting bigger. Reproducing means that they're making more of themselves, or making replicates of themselves. And then development is typically a change over time. So this triangle means change over time. And this development typically refers to changes in gene expression. So some examples of development could include things like puberty or menopause in a human. Living organisms are also able to regulate their internal environment and maintain homeostasis. And remember that homeostasis is just this kind of steady state of being, if you will. So typically the inside of the organism is able to maintain relatively constant conditions, even though the external environment is constantly changing. So probably one of the most common examples of homeostasis is thermoregulation, or the ability to maintain body heat. So with humans, if we get hot, we sweat in order to bring our body heat or body temperature back down to normal. If we're cold, we shiver, which helps to produce heat to bring our body temperature back up to normal. But there are a lot of different examples of homeostasis, including things like blood pressure, blood sugar levels. Even plants can maintain homeostasis. And then another characteristic of life is metabolism. And metabolism are just these chemical reactions that occur in order to keep a living organism alive. And so you've maybe heard of catabolism, which is to break something down, or anabolism, which is to build something up. And these chemical reactions tend to exchange atoms and also energy. And so this is how organisms extract energy from their food, or take energy from the sun and store it into chemical compounds. The atoms also allow organisms to basically recycle the carbons and oxygens and hydrogens in order to make a different molecule. Now, when it comes to viruses, viruses are not alive. And they're these really interesting things, if you will, because they have some of the characteristics of living things, but they don't have all of the characteristics. So technically, viruses are classified as a non-living entity. So they are not alive. So viruses do have order. So they do have atoms and molecules. But that's kind of where the order ends. So they don't really have organelles. They're not made of cells, which brings us to this one right here. So viruses are not made of cells. Viruses also don't respond to stimuli, and they're not able to grow and develop. They just are what they are. They either exist or they don't. They're also not able to regulate their environment or maintain homeostasis. They are also what we call obligate parasites, meaning that they cannot live on their own. They rely on a host, so they rely on a different living organism in order to survive. So they can't conduct metabolism, they can't reproduce on their own. They have to infect a host, and then they actually use the host's resources. So it uses the host's enzymes, their raw materials such as nucleotides and amino acids and energy in order to metabolize and then reproduce and be spread. So expanding upon the characteristics of viruses. So once again, they are acellular, meaning they are not made of cells. And usually when you see this A in front of a word, it means without. So without cells. We don't really know where viruses came from, and on a future slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the hypotheses surrounding the evolutionary origin of viruses. Now, viruses, they can infect nearly all life forms, so you're probably familiar with some animal viruses, but they can also infect plants, and there are even viruses that infect bacteria. Viruses are also species specific, meaning that a virus that is able to infect a human isn't going to be able to infect a plant, or a virus that infects a plant isn't going to be able to infect a human. And a lot of them are even more specific than that. So there are some that are only able to infect humans and maybe not other animals. Or there are some that might be able to infect a particular animal, let's say a dog, but not a human. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about mutations and viruses in a different video, but mutations do sometimes allow viruses to jump between species. For example, you've probably heard of avian flu or swine flu, and these are influenza viruses that are able to be passed from birds to humans or pigs to humans. The recent coronavirus outbreak, the COVID-19 virus, was able to jump from other mammals, probably some wild cats and bats, to humans. So they're species specific, but they can sometimes make the jump from one species to another. Viruses are also tissue specific. For example, a respiratory virus is only going to be able to infect respiratory tissues. A gastrointestinal virus is only going to be able to infect the structures of the digestive system. On plants, there might be some viruses that only affect the leaves or viruses that only affect the stems. Viruses were not discovered until the late 1800s. The tobacco mosaic virus was the first one to be identified. And it was determined that it was not caused by a bacteria because there was the development of a filter that could actually filter out bacteria. And mind you, bacteria are very small, but viruses are smaller. So with this filter, they were able to remove bacteria and anything bigger than bacteria And then when they applied what was left to the tobacco plant, it still developed disease. So there was kind of this hypothesis that there was something even smaller than bacteria that could also be disease causing. And so these pictures here show you kind of the viral infection and how it can affect leaves. And this is actually a microscopic image of the tobacco mosaic virus. Even though the idea of the existence of viruses was discovered in the late 1800s, it wasn't until the 1930s that scientists were actually able to see a virus, and that came with the invention of electron microscopy. And electron microscopy is a even more sensitive form of microscopy than a compound light microscope. So even today, these are kind of highly specialized and very expensive microscopes to have. So the compound light microscope was already invented, but the viruses are too small to be seen with that compound light microscope. But if you see here, once again, this is a picture of the tobacco mosaic virus. And so these little rods here are the virus. And then this one's kind of interesting over here. This is actually something called a bacteriophage. And this is a virus that infects a bacterium. So this is the cell membrane of the bacterium. And then this is the virus that looks kind of like an alien spider. And it is actually injecting genetic material into the bacterium in order to infect it. And we'll talk more about bacteriophages later in the video. So just to reiterate, viruses are very, very small. So let's start by looking here at these eukaryotic cells. I remember from previous biology courses that eukaryotic cells are cells that have a nucleus, and they make up things like animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And eukaryotic cells tend to be larger and more complex than other types of cells. Then we have, for example, this mitochondrion here. And mitochondria, this is an organelle. So once again, there might be several, I believe there can be hundreds or more mitochondria in a single animal cell. So this drawing is not to scale, but you can see the kind of the size scale down here below. Now remember that organelles are made up of macromolecules or other molecules. So these are some of the macromolecules that you probably learned about in a first semester biology class. So lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids are going to be kind of at this end of the scale. And our viruses are kind of in between the size of an organelle and a molecule. So they are made up of molecules, but you can see that they're smaller than bacteria. They're smaller than some organelles, such as mitochondria. So they are very, very small. And remember, we can't see them with a compound light microscope. We have to have the special electron microscopy in order to actually view what these viruses look like. So they are very, very small. These microscopic images also reiterate how small a virus is. So, for example, we've got a eukaryotic cell here. So this might be like an animal cell or something like that. Now remember that prokaryotic cells, so we're primarily talking about bacteria. And bacteria tend to be about 1/10 the size of a eukaryotic cell. So you can see that they are significantly smaller than the eukaryotic cell here. Now, if we were to take one of these cells and essentially blow it up into this picture here, all right, so we're looking at the cell membrane of a prokaryote, which would be basically just the surface of the cell here. This is the virus. So remember, this is a bacteriophage. So if a bacterium is 1/10 the size of a eukaryotic cell, a virus might be 1/10 or even smaller the size of a prokaryotic cell. So we're looking at something that is very, very, very small. As I mentioned before on a previous slide, we really don't know where viruses came from or how they evolved. There's no fossil record of viruses because they're so small and soft. They don't have bones. There are some hypotheses regarding where viruses came from, though. So one hypothesis is that they devolved from free-living cells. And devolved is kind of like backwards evolution, meaning that they possibly were free-living cells that then lost some of those abilities to survive on their own and became parasites. It's also possible that some nucleic acids just escaped from cells and formed these viruses. And we're going to learn in another video that viruses do have genetic material. So they do have either DNA or RNA in them. And so viruses are they're very simple. They're either DNA or RNA, and then there are usually some proteins involved and maybe some lipids in a membrane, and that's the majority of what a virus is. It could also be that they just developed on their own as self-replicating organisms that then became parasitic and relied on a host for replication. So, like I said, we don't really know.